Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Let the day fall away. Find a quiet place, whether you're lying down, sitting back, or simply listening with your eyes closed. This is your time to rest. Tonight, we return to ancient Rome, a city of marble columns, worn cobblestones, and echoes that still shape the world we live in. You're about to hear the final chapter of Julius Caesar's story, a tale not of one man alone, but of an entire civilization as it quietly changes course. As you drift into this calm and reflective journey, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Let me know what you'd like to explore next, or simply share your thoughts about Rome, history, or the power of stories to help us rest. Now, take a slow breath, and let's return to the moment when a republic gave way to something new. Part 1. A Boy of the Julii. The streets of Rome were alive with the sound of wooden wheels on stone. Traders called out in the forum, offering baskets of olives and blocks of salt. Children played in the shadows of marble columns, while the scent of baking bread drifted from small clay ovens tucked into alleyways. The city was already old, worn by centuries of footsteps, but always changing, always pulsing like a living body. On one such morning, under a pale blue sky, a boy named Gaius Julius Caesar walked beside his father. His tunic was plain, but clean. His sandals scuffed from play, but carefully fastened. He was still young, not yet a teenager, but already aware of how people watched them as they passed. They were Julii, members of a once proud family, connected by name to Aeneas, the son of Venus, at least according to the stories whispered by the poets. His father, tall and dignified, kept his head high though their wealth had faded. The Julii were patricians, noble by blood, yet the fortunes of Rome did not always smile equally upon all houses. Still, Caesar's father held a modest post in the government. He wore the white-bordered toga of a magistrate and moved through the crowd with practiced calm. He greeted people with short nods and kept walking. Caesar looked up at him, memorizing his bearing. The boy had already begun to understand the difference between power and dignity, and he studied it the way others studied scrolls or stones. Their home stood on the slopes of the Suburra, close enough to the bustle of common life, but just high enough to remain respectable. The door was wooden, set into a wall of pale stone, and opened into a shaded atrium. Inside, the air smelled of oil lamps and pressed laurel leaves. A small fountain trickled into a shallow pool, its sound soft and even. His mother, Aurelia, greeted them with a gentle smile. She was a strong woman, careful with words and firm with discipline. She taught Caesar to speak clearly, to think before answering, and to listen more than he spoke. She believed in learning and insisted that her son memorize the histories of Rome and the sayings of the old philosophers. Lessons came early in the day, while the air was still cool. Caesar sat beside a small wax tablet and listened to his tutor read from scrolls of Livy and Homer. He learned the laws of Rome, the speeches of old consuls, and the weight of each word in Latin and Greek. He did not complain. He asked questions. He remembered. When lessons were over, he walked the streets with his father or joined boys from nearby families in friendly games that imitated the Senate or mimicked great battles. Sometimes they built wooden swords and shields and played at being Scipio or Hannibal. Caesar always took the role of the commander, not because he demanded it, but because the others gave it to him. In the evenings, as oil lamps flickered, the family gathered in the triclinium. They dined on bread, cheese, lentils, and the occasional dish of salted fish. The talk was quiet, measured. His father spoke of politics, of laws debated in the Senate, of rising men and fading fortunes. Caesar listened more than he spoke, storing each name, each event, in a quiet corner of his mind. One night, as the moon rose over the rooftops, his father sat beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You carry the name of the Julii," he said softly. "But names alone do not build legacies. Character, Caesar. That is what lasts. The boy nodded. He felt the weight of those words settle over him like a second cloak. In the silence that followed, a distant dog barked, and the wind moved the flame in the lamp beside them. The years passed quietly. His father remained a steady figure, firm but fair. His mother guided him with care. But the city around them grew louder, more unstable. Whispers of unrest reached their ears. Corruption deepened in the Senate, and the streets became more unpredictable. The Republic still held, but cracks were appearing in its marble pillars. Caesar was 12 when news reached them of the death of his uncle Gaius Marius. A famous general, Marius had once been the pride of Rome, a man who had reformed the legions and stood against the aristocratic Sulla. He was a hero to some and a threat to others. The boy had met him once, in a crowded garden filled with polished statues and orange trees. Marius had been older then, his hair gray, his eyes sharp despite the years. He had looked at Caesar for a long moment before speaking. "Be wary of soft words in hard times," he had said. Now he was gone, and with his passing, the balance of power in Rome began to tilt again. Soon after, Sulla marched on the city. The Senate bent, and blood touched the stones of the Forum. The proscriptions began, lists of names posted in public, marking men as enemies of the state. Property was seized, lives ended without trial. The air grew thick with tension. Families whispered behind closed doors. Friends became strangers. Caesar's father fell ill during those troubled months. The sickness came slowly, stealing strength by the day. He died with dignity, lying beneath woven blankets while his wife and son watched in silence. The boy was just 16. He stood at the pyre, holding a handful of herbs, and stared at the flames as they reached upward. The smoke carried more than ashes. It carried the last warmth of the man who had taught him restraint. After the mourning, the weight of the household fell to Caesar. His mother offered strength, but it was he who would now carry the name forward. He was still young, still learning, but Rome did not wait for boys to grow comfortable. The world outside kept moving. That same year, Sulla demanded that Caesar divorce his wife Cornelia. She was the daughter of Cinna, another enemy of Sulla, and the marriage had been arranged during different tides of politics. Caesar refused, quietly, firmly, without arrogance. He would not dishonor his wife or betray his family. It was a dangerous decision. Sulla stripped him of his priesthood and his inheritance. Friends urged him to yield. They spoke of safety, of wisdom, but he held his ground. Eventually, with pressure from others in the Senate, Sulla relented. He spared the boy, but he reportedly said, "In that young man are many Mariuses." It was not a compliment. To avoid further danger, Caesar left the city. He traveled east, away from the smoke and noise of Roman politics. He served in the military, proving himself not just through blood, but through discipline. He carried out orders, observed command structures, and learned the quiet codes of soldiers. His courage became known. His name began to rise again, not through scandal, but through steady merit. In Cilicia, along the rough coasts of Asia Minor, Caesar found more than battles. He found time to reflect, to read, and to write. He sent letters home to his mother, asking after her health, reporting his modest successes. He kept his words plain and clear. One day, during a voyage across the Aegean, his ship was captured by pirates. The waters had been dangerous for years, and these men, rough and greedy, demanded a ransom. They set the price at 20 talents of silver. Caesar laughed. "You do not know who I am," he told them. "I am worth at least 50. They were puzzled, but they raised the demand. As messengers were sent to gather the ransom, Caesar remained in their camp. He walked among them without fear. He read poetry aloud. He wrote short speeches and recited them. When the pirates mocked him, he told them, calmly, that once he was free, he would return and have them punished. They laughed. He did not. When the ransom was paid, Caesar was released. He returned as promised, with ships and men. He captured the pirates and had them executed, not out of cruelty, but out of duty. They had broken the peace of the sea and had not believed his word. He had warned them. When the tale reached Rome, people spoke of the boy who had paid more for his own life and kept his promise. He was young, still learning, but his presence was no longer small. In the years that followed, he returned to Rome with a quiet determination. He took small posts, built alliances, and moved carefully. He studied the language of politics, the games of favor, and the ways in which power moved behind closed doors. But the child who once sat beneath laurel leaves, listening to his father's soft words, was gone. In his place stood a man of calm resolve, forged in storms, waiting for the moment to rise. And so the story begins. Part 2. The Shadow of Marius. The streets of Rome were quieter than before. The Republic still stood, but it no longer breathed with the same rhythm. Power whispered now, rather than marched. The Forum had grown cautious, and eyes watched from shadows behind stone pillars. The old families still held their seats, still spoke in the curia, still raised their voices in long debates. But something beneath the surface had shifted. Gaius Julius Caesar, barely past his 20th year, walked among these voices with care. He was no longer a boy in sandals shadowing his father. He had returned from military service with a sharper posture and the careful gaze of someone who had learned to read a room not just by sound, but by silence. He did not move quickly. He did not raise his voice, and he always listened longer than he spoke. The name of Marius still echoed in the corners of the city. It lingered in the marble steps of the Temple of Jupiter, in the cracked stones of the military camps beyond the city gates, and in the tired eyes of veterans who remembered what had been promised and what had not been kept. Caesar remembered him too, not only as a family member, but as a presence that had loomed over his youth like a statue in the garden, proud, powerful, and unblinking. Gaius Marius had been a man of iron will. He had risen not through noble blood, but through sheer ability. He reformed the legions, opened doors for common men, and led Rome to victory more than once. But his rise brought enemies. His fall had been bitter. His name had become a fault line in the politics of Rome. To some, he was a hero. To others, a threat to order. To Caesar, he was both memory and lesson. Now, back in the city, Caesar walked with the weight of that legacy. The Senate might forgive a man's bloodline, but it never forgot it. He did not speak of Marius openly. He did not invoke the name unless necessary. But in the choices he made, the allies he sought, and the stances he took, there were echoes of that shadowed influence. He resumed his public career with quiet confidence. He took up a position as a minor advocate and began to appear in court, representing cases that others overlooked. He spoke well, never too quickly, never with too much emotion. He knew that passion frightened the Senate more than power, and so he shaped his words like marble, measured, firm, and designed to endure. Those who listened closely began to notice, not just what he said, but what he did not say. He avoided direct attacks. He offered praise to men who had done little to earn it. He made allies without asking for favors in return. And slowly, his name began to circulate again, not loudly, not yet, but often enough that others began to watch. His mother, Aurelia, remained a quiet pillar in his life. She offered counsel in private, never pushing too far, never asking more than he wished to reveal. In their garden, beneath the fig trees, they spoke of politics as one might speak of weather, acknowledging the winds, but never assuming they could be tamed. She reminded him of patience, of balance, and of dignity. In those early years, Caesar lived modestly. He spent more than he earned, but he understood that appearances mattered more than coin. He dressed simply, but well. He attended festivals, offered generous donations, and showed himself in public with confidence. He did not try to rise too fast, but he did not remain still. When the opportunity came to serve as a military tribune again, he accepted. He left Rome to assist with organizing troops and calming the unrest in distant provinces. He rode through hills and valleys, listened to governors and commanders, and watched how authority bent or broke under pressure. These were lessons not found in scrolls or speeches. While abroad, he wrote letters to those in Rome, carefully worded, never excessive, always respectful. He offered observations without opinions, praise without flattery. In doing so, he built quiet trust. When he returned, he found doors open that had once been closed. He pursued the office of quaestor, the first step in the traditional path of Roman politics. It was not a powerful role, but it granted access to the Senate, to records, and to the flows of public money. He campaigned without arrogance, leaning on family connections, old favors, and his growing reputation for steadiness. He was elected. As quaestor, he traveled again, this time to Hispania, where Rome's presence was strong but not always welcomed. He inspected accounts, met with administrators, and helped resolve disputes. The work was tedious, the climate hot and dry, the days long. But Caesar treated it with seriousness. He believed that every position, no matter how small, revealed character. It was during this time that he visited a statue of Alexander the Great. Alone in a temple courtyard, he stood before the stone figure of the Macedonian king. He looked at the calm face, the carved armor, the hand extended as if still leading a charge across invisible plains. Caesar was older now than Alexander had been when he conquered much of the known world. He did not speak aloud, but a silence formed around him. When he returned to his tent, he sat for a long time without moving. Not in anger, not in regret, but in quiet determination. He would not chase glory, he would build it. His next step was the office of aedile. It was a chance to organize public games, festivals, and repairs to the city's infrastructure. The position required money, more than he had. But he understood that generosity was an investment in loyalty. He borrowed heavily, offered games more lavish than any had expected, and gained favor with the people. The streets of Rome buzzed with his name. Children watched parades he arranged. Elders sat beneath new colonnades funded from his pocket. The city looked brighter for a time, and the name of Caesar became not just a whisper among senators, but a song among the crowds. He did not stop. He sought the position of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. It was a bold move. He was young for the role, and two older, more seasoned men stood against him. But Caesar understood something his rivals did not. The people remembered the games. The senators remembered his careful diplomacy, and the priests remembered his calm, respectful presence. He won. Now, as the religious head of the Roman world, he gained not only prestige but a home in the heart of the city and protection from legal attack. He moved carefully, not arrogantly, never overstepping. But each step forward was a step that could not be taken back. During these years, the memory of Marius remained near. Some senators watched Caesar's rise and saw only ambition. Others saw a chance to harness his growing popularity. Caesar allowed each to believe what suited them. He did not speak of his uncle in the Senate, but he did visit the tomb, quietly, alone. He knelt before the stone, placed his hand on the cool surface, and whispered no words. He simply stood there, a living heir to a legacy that Rome had tried to forget. In time, his marriage to Cornelia ended with her death. It had been a union of politics, but one of respect as well. Her passing was quiet, and Caesar did not remarry immediately. Instead, he focused on his work, his debts, and the quiet path ahead. He was chosen as praetor, one of the highest offices short of consul. He now held the authority to judge legal disputes, oversee courts, and represent Rome in distant provinces. His voice in the Senate carried more weight. His actions gained more attention. Still, he did not rush. He walked each step as if it had always belonged to him, yet never assumed the next would come without effort. He gave speeches that moved crowds without alarming senators. He offered reforms that seemed small but hinted at larger ideas. He had begun to see Rome not as a city, but as a system, a living machine of laws, customs, and memories. To change it, one did not shatter it. One adjusted the levers, shifted the gears, and turned the wheels a little at a time. The shadow of Marius grew shorter with each passing year. Not because it faded, but because Caesar had begun to cast a shadow of his own. And still the city watched. And still he moved forward. Part 3. Captured by Pirates. The sun rose slow and golden over the Aegean Sea. The waves moved gently beneath the ship's wooden hull, each crest reflecting the pale morning light like hammered bronze. Gulls circled in the sky, calling out to each other in lazy arcs. The sail flapped softly, and the ropes creaked in rhythm with the sea's endless breath. Caesar stood near the prow, his hand resting on the rail, eyes scanning the open horizon. He had set out from Asia Minor, returning to Rome after fulfilling duties in the region. The wind was favorable. The journey, though long, promised peace. The ocean had a way of making a man reflect, and Caesar, as always, watched and listened to the world around him. He was not alone. A small crew moved about the deck, tightening ropes, checking provisions, speaking in quiet tones. A few officers traveled with him, young men of ambition and learning. They passed the time discussing poetry and politics, eating dried fruits and flatbread, and sleeping beneath the stars. Nights were cool, mornings were crisp. The voyage seemed ordinary. Then, without warning, sails appeared on the horizon. Not the merchant kind, nor Roman ships. These were low, fast, and silent. 2, perhaps 3, closing from opposite sides. The crew raised alarm. Men rushed to arms, though there were few weapons aboard. The attackers moved with speed and certainty. Within moments, it was clear what they were. Pirates. They boarded swiftly, shouting in harsh accents, blades drawn, but not bloodied. These were not men seeking war. They wanted cargo, coin, and captives. They searched the ship with the ease of those who had done it many times before. Caesar was taken with the others, bound not roughly, but firmly, and moved to a different vessel. He did not resist. He did not speak. He watched. The pirates led their captives to a small island off the coast of what is now modern-day Turkey. It was rocky, with low scrub and no towns in sight. They camped in a cove where ships could not be seen from the open sea. Here, they began their negotiations. They did not know who Caesar was. When asked for ransom, the pirates demanded 20 talents of silver, a large sum but not unusual for Roman citizens of standing. Caesar laughed. "You ask too little," he told them. "I am worth at least 50. They paused, unsure if it was a joke. He was not smiling. Eventually, they agreed to his suggestion and raised the ransom. Messengers were sent across the water, bearing letters and instructions to gather the amount. The pirates believed the deal had gone in their favor. They did not realize the man they had captured had just begun to take control of the situation. Days passed. Caesar remained among them, no longer treated like a prisoner. He walked freely about the island, under light watch. He spoke to the pirates not as a captive, but as an amused guest. He read aloud from books he carried. He wrote verses and speeches, and when the pirates failed to appreciate them, he mocked them gently for their ignorance. At times, he joined their meals, listening to their stories and offering tales of Rome in return. They laughed with him, not realizing the edge behind his calm voice. He told them plainly that once the ransom was paid, he would return and have them punished. They laughed again. He did not. The men around him began to see what the pirates could not. His presence did not shrink in captivity. It expanded. The island was no longer their camp. It became his temporary court. He observed them. He learned their rhythms, their habits, their defenses. He noted the layout of the cove, the number of men, the condition of their ships. Every hour they spent together, Caesar was preparing. The ransom arrived after several weeks. He thanked them for their hospitality, He boarded a ship with his companions and left without incident. Not long after, he returned, with vessels, soldiers, and Roman authority behind him. He hunted them down without delay, captured them, and reclaimed the silver. Some of his officers advised selling the pirates into slavery or holding them for trial. Caesar refused. He had promised them punishment. They were executed by order, quickly and cleanly, without cruelty. He did not speak of revenge. He said only that Rome must be respected and that promises must be kept. News of the incident spread quietly at first, but those who heard the tale noted the strange calmness of it. A young Roman noble, captured by pirates, had declared his worth, laughed in their faces, and then returned to keep his word. Not with anger, not with fury, but with simple, efficient purpose. It became more than a story. It became a symbol. Caesar returned to Rome not as a victim, but as a man who had taken control of his own narrative. His name grew again, not just in the Forum, but in the minds of those who valued clarity, order, and strength without cruelty. The city, though still torn with tension, welcomed his return. He resumed his political life with greater confidence, now bearing the air of a man who had been tested and found unshaken. He continued his climb. After serving as praetor, he received a posting in Hispania as governor. The region was wealthy, complex, and filled with the quiet problems of distant rule. Bandits roamed the hills. Local leaders tested the boundaries of Roman law. Taxes flowed unevenly. Roads broke down in places where no Roman soldiers had walked in years. Caesar entered this world with the same quiet intensity he had shown on the pirate island. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He observed, learned, and then acted. He reorganized tax collection. He resolved disputes with words before raising arms. He offered Roman citizenship to locals who had long been overlooked. In return, they offered loyalty. When bandits struck caravans, he responded quickly, using both soldiers and scouts. He cleaned the roads. He fixed what others ignored. Wealth began to flow more steadily from the region, and the Senate noticed. He also took command of a small military force, leading campaigns against nearby tribes. These were not grand battles, but steady, necessary ones. He won with careful planning, not reckless charges. His men respected him, not just for his strategy, but for his presence. He ate beside them, walked the same roads, shared the same nights in rough camps beneath the stars. Victory came. Tribute followed. And with it, the reward of a triumph. A ceremonial return to Rome, dressed in white, granted the right to celebrate a military success. But there was a catch. To celebrate a triumph, Caesar had to remain outside the city until the day of the parade. To stand for consul, the next great office in his political journey, he had to enter the city as a civilian. He could not do both. He chose the consulship. He gave up the triumph and stepped across the city gates in plain clothes, as a man ready for the next level of leadership. Rome had seen many generals before, but not all were willing to give up glory for power. This decision, quiet as it was, rippled through the city. He would not chase honors. He would take what mattered. Part 4. Path to Power. The city of Rome sat under a silver sky, its streets washed clean by the morning rain. Marble columns stood tall against the clouds, and rooftops shimmered as the light returned. Beneath the surface, the republic stirred. Senators walked with slow steps beneath shaded porticos. Slaves carried scrolls and water jugs. Merchants opened stalls with careful hands. The city was vast and heavy with history, but still uncertain of its future. Gaius Julius Caesar, no longer a minor figure in the Forum, entered this moment with calm determination. He had returned from Hispania not with a triumph, but with respect. His choice had been deliberate. By setting aside celebration, he had claimed something deeper, a place in the minds of Rome's decision-makers as a man who understood strategy, not just in war, but in life. His next goal was clear: the consulship. It was the highest office in the Roman Republic. Only 2 were elected each year, and those who won, it carried not just authority, but the ability to shape laws, command armies, and speak before all others in the Senate. Caesar began his campaign with precision. He did not rush from house to house or shout from podiums. Instead, he walked through the city, meeting people face to face. He spoke in plain words, looked others in the eye, and asked for their trust. He met with the wealthy, promising calm leadership. He met with the poor, promising relief. He listened. He remembered names. He offered small kindnesses that would not be forgotten. His competitors were seasoned. Some were older, others more cautious. One of them, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, came from a strict, conservative background. He stood for order and the preservation of the old ways. He viewed Caesar as a man of ambition, too willing to embrace the shifting winds of power. Their rivalry grew quietly, like a fire under wet wood. Caesar, aware of the Senate's suspicions, made careful alliances. One of the most powerful men in Rome at the time was Marcus Licinius Crassus, wealthy beyond measure, a man who could sway markets with a whisper. Another was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known simply as Pompey the Great, a military hero adored by the legions and feared by foreign kings. These 2 men did not trust each other. They had fought for influence in the past, each pulling Rome in different directions. Caesar approached them both, not with promises, but with perspective. He reminded them that divided, they could be resisted. United, they could shape the Republic. This quiet arrangement became known later as the First Triumvirate. It was never official. No law announced it. But from that moment on, Caesar had support behind him that few could match. Crassus brought wealth, Pompey brought soldiers, and Caesar brought vision. He was elected consul in 59 BCE. The forum filled with people. Some cheered, others watched in silence. Caesar stood tall in the white robes of the office, speaking with calm and certainty. He promised to uphold the laws, to serve the Republic, and to work for the good of all Romans. Behind the words, another path began to open. During his consulship, Caesar introduced a series of reforms. He did not overturn the system. He adjusted it. He passed laws that gave land to veterans, reduced debt pressure, and stabilized the grain supply. These were not radical acts, but they shifted the weight of Rome's balance. He made political moves that unsettled the Senate. He ignored obstruction from his co-consul, Bibulus, who withdrew from public life and claimed the heavens were ill-omened, attempting to block Caesar's actions through superstition. Caesar pressed on. He published the laws directly to the people, bypassing old traditions that kept decisions hidden in the chambers of the elite. He spoke in public spaces with careful words and invited citizens to listen and decide for themselves. Not all approved. Murmurs rose in the Senate. Some called him dangerous. Others feared the crowd's growing affection. But Caesar knew the weight of silence. He responded not with threats, but with clarity. His reforms continued. Roads were repaired. Court procedures were clarified. Governors in the provinces were held to stricter rules. In his private life, he married again. His new wife, Calpurnia, was young and gentle. She rarely appeared in public, but their home became a place of quiet gatherings, where scholars, officers, and statesmen shared ideas over simple meals. Caesar did not build walls around himself. He opened doors. As the year of his consulship neared its end, a new opportunity appeared. Traditionally, former consuls were assigned governorships in distant provinces. Some were given peaceful regions, others more turbulent ones. Caesar asked for a command in Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, territories along the northern edge of Roman lands, close to what is now modern France and the Balkans. At the last moment, Transalpine Gaul was added to his assignment. This land, wild and restless, bordered unclaimed territory beyond the mountains. It offered little comfort, but great potential. The Senate approved the assignment, but not without hesitation. They hoped the challenge would delay him, keep him far from Rome, and test his patience. Caesar accepted the command with a quiet nod. He did not see exile. He saw the beginning of something larger. In preparation, he reviewed maps, met with engineers, and consulted merchants who knew the northern trade routes. He spoke with veterans who had marched those roads. He studied the tribes beyond Rome's borders, not just their weapons, but their customs, alliances, and fears. He understood that war was not only fought with swords, it was fought with time. Before he departed, he gave a final speech in Rome, brief and clear. He thanked the people, promised to serve with honor, and asked for their continued trust. Then he left the city. Northward, the mountains waited. Part 5. The Rise of a General. Part 5. The Rise of a General. The roads that led north from Rome grew narrower as they climbed. The olive trees gave way to pines. The air grew cooler. Villages thinned. Outposts marked the edges of Roman control, each with its own rhythm, its own concerns, its own quiet hopes. Caesar rode at the head of his column, not in a gilded chariot or behind layers of armor, but on horseback, wrapped in a travel cloak, speaking softly with his officers as they passed through small towns and military forts. He was not yet the legend Rome would one day recall. He was simply a consul turned governor, assigned to manage territories beyond the Alps. But he carried something more than authority. He carried vision. His first tasks were administrative. Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum were important regions, gateways to trade routes, recruiting grounds for soldiers, and buffers between Rome and the untamed lands beyond. Caesar worked quickly. He met with local leaders, surveyed roads, and restructured taxes to ensure funds flowed smoothly into military supplies. He also spent long hours among the legions. These were not fresh recruits. They were veterans, accustomed to hard living and harder orders. Many had fought under other commanders. They knew discipline, they knew fear, and they knew when a leader earned their respect. Caesar did not shout. He did not threaten. He listened. He spoke to his soldiers plainly. He shared their meals. He praised their endurance when the days were long and cold. And when decisions needed to be made, he explained the reasons behind them. The legions watched him, tested him in their own quiet way, and found in him something rare. He became one of them. Not above them, not behind them, but beside them. And then the call came. Across the border in Transalpine Gaul, a tribe known as the Helvetii had begun to move. Their homeland, troubled by overpopulation and pressure from enemies, no longer offered peace. They planned a great migration, thousands of people, men, women, and children, traveling westward through Roman territory in search of a new beginning. To many in the Senate, this was a distant issue. To Caesar, it was a turning point. He rode north, crossing into lands where Roman rule was thin. He met with envoys from the Helvetii, who requested safe passage. They offered promises of peace and order. But Caesar saw more than travelers. He saw risk, disorder, the possibility of war spilling across the frontier. He denied the request. He ordered a wall built across the path ahead, stretching for many miles. Earth was piled high. Ditches were dug. Watchposts were erected. It was not an act of hostility, but of caution, and it sent a message. The Helvetii turned aside, seeking other routes. Caesar pursued. His legions moved with care, not in haste. They tracked the migration, gathered intelligence, and positioned themselves between the Helvetii and vulnerable Roman towns. Eventually, battle became inevitable. The two forces met near Bibracte. The fight lasted for hours. The Helvetii fought fiercely, with the desperation of those who had no home left to lose. But Caesar's troops were disciplined. They responded to commands with precision. They held the line when it wavered. And when the signal was given, they pressed forward with quiet resolve. Victory came by dusk. Caesar treated the survivors with dignity. He allowed them to return to their homeland and rebuild under Roman guidance. He did not seek to destroy, but to restore order. News of the victory reached Rome within weeks. Some senators praised the swift resolution. Others worried at the boldness of his actions. He had taken initiative. He had used his judgment without waiting for Senate approval. But the people admired it. The soldiers respected it. And Caesar, though far from the forum, felt his influence grow. More campaigns followed. Tribes across Gaul, long divided, began to shift. Some aligned with Rome. Others resisted. Caesar moved among them like a steady current, offering peace where he could, preparing for war where he must. Each year brought new challenges. In one region, the Belgae rose in revolt. In another, Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine, testing the borders. Caesar responded with balance. He built fortifications. He strengthened alliances. And when conflict came, he fought with clear strategy. He wrote detailed accounts of each campaign. These writings, sent back to Rome, were not merely reports. They were crafted to inform, to shape public opinion, and to present Caesar as a man of logic, reason, and Roman virtue. They were simple, clear, and powerful. In them, he never spoke of glory. He spoke of duty. He never boasted of power. He described the movements of men, the weight of decisions, and the fragile line between peace and violence. The people read them, and they remembered. His legions grew not only in number, but in loyalty. He distributed spoils carefully, ensured fair treatment, and never asked more than what was possible. In return, the soldiers followed him without question. They marched through forests, crossed rivers, and climbed hills that had never seen Roman flags. They endured snow, hunger, and sleepless nights. And when Caesar stood before them, they stood taller. In one campaign, he reached the English Channel and gazed across the sea. The island of Britannia lay beyond, a land known by rumor, touched only by traders and myth. He did not invade, not yet, but he marked it on his maps. He understood its future. The Senate, watching from afar, grew uneasy. Caesar was no longer a governor managing borders. He had become a force. Some senators sent envoys urging restraint. Others praised his success and asked for protection of their interests. Caesar responded to all with respect, but he kept moving forward. One winter, a rebellion rose suddenly in a region thought to be secure. Local leaders turned against Rome, killing Roman citizens and attacking garrisons. Caesar reacted with speed. He marched hundreds of miles in harsh weather, caught the rebels off guard, and restored control in a matter of weeks. The message was clear. Rome's reach would not be questioned. But Caesar did not punish entire villages. He met with local elders. He listened to their concerns. He offered stability in exchange for peace. And in many cases, they accepted. As the years passed, Caesar's name became known not just in Rome, but across Gaul. Traders spoke of him in marketplaces. Soldiers carved his initials into stone. Tribes debated whether to resist him or ally with him. His face appeared on coins. His words traveled faster than his armies. But through it all, he remained composed. He wore his authority lightly, but firmly. He did not speak of empire. He spoke of order. He did not seek vengeance. He sought solutions. And as winter settled again across the hills and valleys, the roads of Gaul lay quiet under Roman watch. Part 6. Gaul and Glory. The seasons turned in quiet rhythm across the Gallic countryside. Winter faded and the forest stirred. Snow slipped from pine branches. The earth, cold and quiet, began to soften. Birds returned in soft flocks. Streams, once frozen, ran again with clear water. The people who lived in the hill forts and scattered villages gathered in council, watching the horizon with wary eyes. They knew the rhythm of their land, but now a new rhythm had taken root. The steady march of Roman legions, the raised voice of Latin commands, the distant clang of iron on wood, all had become part of the air. Caesar had not come as a raider. He had not come as a tyrant. He had come as a force of calm transformation. And the land remembered. Year by year, his campaigns had extended the reach of Rome deeper into Gaul. His presence was no longer a temporary shift. It had become a framework. Tribes that once moved freely began to mark Roman boundaries on their maps. Chieftains sent sons to serve as hostages, not as prisoners, but as symbols of new arrangements. Roman merchants traveled more freely, bringing olive oil, glassware, and wine in quiet exchange for wool, salt, and amber. But not all welcomed the change. Not all bent willingly. Some resisted with blades, others with silence. And among them, a leader began to rise. Vercingetorix, a man of quiet strength and fierce loyalty. Born among the Arverni, he saw the future with clarity. He did not hate Caesar. He feared what would remain of Gaul once Caesar was finished. He called the tribes together. He spoke not with shouts, but with steady resolve. He asked not for blind war, but for unity. Under his guidance, fires were lit on distant hills. Riders traveled the forest paths, and messages passed hand to hand. A great revolt began to take shape, not in panic, but in purpose. Caesar, deep in the provinces, received word of the unrest. He did not react with anger. He summoned his commanders. He reviewed reports. He studied the pattern of events. And then, in the heart of winter, he moved. The roads were icy, the air sharp and dry. His legions marched with care, wrapped in cloaks and bound in leather. They crossed frozen rivers on foot, carrying their gear in silence. They passed through villages where the hearths had gone cold and the people watched from doorways. The wind carried no songs. But the soldiers marched. They trusted the man who led them. In a short span of weeks, Caesar re-established supply lines, reinforced vulnerable positions, and secured loyal allies. He offered mercy where it was possible. He fortified where it was not. His presence reminded the tribes that Rome did not sleep, even in snow. Then came the spring, and with it war. Vercingetorix, now in open command of the Gallic alliance, struck at Roman garrisons, cut off roads, and burned settlements that might serve Caesar's cause. His strategy was not to defeat the legions in a single battle, but to starve them, wear them down, deny them shelter. He ordered his own cities burned rather than let them fall into Roman hands. It was a cruel decision, but it slowed Caesar's advance. The campaign that followed was not swift. It moved like a storm held behind a mountain, gathering, circling, waiting for the right moment. Caesar did not rush. He studied the new tactics. He spoke with scouts, engineers, and interpreters. He remained calm, even when food grew scarce and roads were blocked. His soldiers watched him closely. If he felt fear, he did not show it. Then came the siege of Gogovia. It was high ground, held with strength, defended with unity. Caesar advanced, tested the walls, and withdrew. He attempted a surprise assault, but the defenders held firm. Losses mounted. Morale shook. And for the first time in years, Caesar chose retreat. He did not hide it. He gathered his officers. He explained the situation. He offered no excuses, only clarity, and his men followed him still. They retreated not in defeat, but in discipline. They moved together, silent and prepared. Then came the turning point. Vercingetorix, confident in his position, gathered his forces at a place called Alesia, a hilltop fortress surrounded by open land and low rivers. It was a strong position, but it could be surrounded, and Caesar did just that. He ordered a ring of fortifications built around the city. Ditches, palisades, towers, earthworks. His soldiers labored day and night. They built a wall that faced inward to trap the defenders. Then they built a second wall that faced outward to protect from reinforcements. 2 circles of defense, a quiet iron cage. Vercingetorix, inside, waited. Outside, Gallic allies gathered to break the siege. The final battle came not in one day, but over many. The Gallic relief force attacked from beyond the walls. The defenders within attacked from behind. and Caesar stood between both. He did not flinch. He moved calmly from post to post. He directed reserves, adjusted formations, rode his horse along the lines with his red cloak visible from every hill. And slowly the storm passed. The relief army broke. The defenders surrendered. Vercingetorix, seeing the end, mounted his horse, dressed in full armor, and rode through the Roman lines. He dismounted before Caesar. He removed his helmet. He bowed his head, and he said nothing. Caesar nodded. The war in Gaul was not fully over, but the center of resistance had fallen. Rome now held the land in more than name. Villages that once watched the horizon in fear now watched the roads for Roman caravans. Local leaders signed treaties and raised Roman standards beside their own. Caesar did not claim victory with parades. He held assemblies. He reviewed supplies. He ensured fair treatment of prisoners. He stabilized borders. And then, as his duties continued, he wrote. He described the campaigns with simplicity. He listed names of battles, distances marched, rivers crossed. He described the courage of the legions and the strength of the Gallic people. He did not call them savages. He called them brave. He did not mock their leaders. He described their choices. His commentaries on the Gallic War circulated widely. Even those who feared him read them with interest. Even those who opposed him could not ignore the clarity of his prose. Rome had never seen a general who fought with such command and wrote with such restraint. His words became a mirror to his method. Firm, measured, enduring, and though he remained far from the Senate, his presence was felt in every marble hall, in every whispered conversation. He was no longer a governor on the edge of empire. He had become something more, and Rome, restless and proud, began to wonder what would come next. Part 7. The River Rubicon. The roads leading south were quieter than before. Spring had not yet touched the hills, and the fields lay bare beneath a sky the color of faded marble. The legions moved in steady formation, their footsteps pressed into the damp earth, their armor covered with a thin layer of dust. No drums sounded. No banners waved. These were not the signs of a parade, but the rhythm of preparation. Caesar rode near the front, his cloak pulled tightly around his shoulders. The weight of past campaigns rested on him, though his posture did not show it. Years in Gaul had reshaped more than borders. They had changed his name from familiar to unavoidable. Everywhere he went, people watched not only his actions, but his intentions. The Senate had called for his dismissal. They insisted that his term was over. They expected him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. And they made that expectation clear through decrees delivered with polished words and cold signatures. But Caesar had seen enough of politics to understand the message behind those words. He knew what awaited him if he returned without his army. Trials, accusations, the loss of everything he had built. Not just honors and lands, but the trust of his men. The loyalty he had earned mile by mile, in snow and in sun, would vanish the moment he handed over his command. He did not fear debate. He feared silence after betrayal. So he waited. He listened to messengers from Rome. He read each letter in full, line by line. And when no compromise arrived, he began his quiet march south. No declarations were made. No formal lines were drawn. But every mile brought him closer to a boundary more powerful than stone or law. The Rubicon was a narrow river. It wound through the countryside like a soft thread, its waters clear and slow. On one side stood the provinces he governed as proconsul. On the other lay the lands under direct rule of the Senate. Crossing it with an army meant defiance. It meant war. He arrived at its bank in the early morning. Mist drifted above the water. The trees nearby stood still. No banners marked the spot. No statues warned travelers of the weight this place carried. Caesar dismounted. He stood for a long moment, watching the flow of water. Officers gathered at a respectful distance. No words passed between them. They knew what this crossing would mean. The men who followed him waited without question. They had crossed rivers before, but never like this. This one asked something more than obedience. It asked for belief. Caesar turned to his officers and spoke only once. Then he stepped into the shallows. The water rose to his boots. It ran cool around his ankles. And then he walked forward, steady and quiet, until he stood on the opposite bank. The moment passed without fanfare. But history shifted. The legions followed. Not with cheers, but with calm resolve. One by one, they crossed the Rubicon. Not in haste, not in fear. Simply with certainty. They made camp not far from the river. Tents were pitched. Fires lit. Bread broken. And in Rome, the message spread faster than any rider could carry it. Caesar had crossed. The Senate responded with alarm. Some fled the city. Others sent hurried orders to loyal generals. All waited for Caesar's next move. But he did not rush to the capital. He paused. He gathered his strength. He ensured the routes behind him were secure. Then he began the slow advance. At every town, gates opened. Civilians watched from rooftops, unsure of what to say. Some offered food. Others asked questions. Few resisted. He moved carefully, never looting, never punishing. He kept discipline among his men. The cities he passed remained intact. He was not there to destroy. He was there to reclaim the balance he believed had been lost. In the distance, Pompey prepared. Once allies, they now stood on opposite sides. Pompey commanded troops, though not as seasoned. He held the Senate's favor, though not its full confidence. He ordered a retreat from Rome, regrouping in the south to gather strength. Caesar entered the capital quietly. There was no parade, no triumph, just the firm sound of footsteps in the forum. He walked through the Curia. The Senate seats sat empty. He did not take them. He did not declare himself dictator. Instead, he secured grain supplies. He stabilized the treasury. He ensured order. And then, just as quietly, he left again. He moved south, toward Pompey, toward the edge of civil war. The people of Rome watched and waited. They had seen generals rise and fall. They had seen promises made and forgotten. But Caesar, calm and constant, moved with a different purpose. Not to rule with fear, but to decide, through action, what the Republic would become. As the spring winds blew across the hills, the old stones of the city whispered among themselves, and the river behind him continued its quiet path to the sea. Part 8. The Battle for Rome. Dust hung in the air above the roads of Italy. Wagons creaked under the weight of grain and armor. The clatter of hooves echoed through valleys where olive trees grew in quiet rows. The land had seen armies before, foreign invaders, rival consuls, restless mercenaries, but now it watched its own sons marching against each other. Rome no longer sat in silence. It held its breath. Caesar moved south with purpose, but not haste. His men stayed in formation. Their discipline remained intact. They did not pillage. They did not shout. Each step was taken with the awareness that they were not entering enemy territory, but the heart of their own homeland. Pompey had left the capital before Caesar arrived. He had not waited for confrontation. He moved instead to Brundisium, a port city near the Adriatic Sea. There, ships waited. Allies gathered. Letters flew between provinces like birds caught in a sudden wind. Senators who had once debated taxes and temple repairs now debated the movements of troops. Caesar arrived outside Brundisium's gates. He did not storm the city. He sent envoys. He opened the door to negotiation. No answer came. Inside, Pompey prepared his departure. He knew Caesar's strength. He had seen the loyalty of his troops, the clarity of his decisions. He chose distance over battle. He ordered ships loaded, sails raised, and crossed the sea to Greece. Caesar entered Brundisium not as a conqueror, but as a man confirming that the war had moved beyond Italy. There was little celebration. There was no speech, only quiet movement. From there, he turned west, securing Spain before chasing Pompey across the sea. The campaign in Hispania was swift. The legions stationed there were loyal to the Senate, but not unshakable. Caesar moved with patience, surrounding towns, cutting off supplies, and offering mercy. He avoided unnecessary violence. He gave local leaders a chance to choose. Most surrendered. Others joined him. He met resistance only once in force, and even then, he allowed survivors to leave with their dignity intact. Back in Rome, the forum remained tense. Markets reopened, temples filled with prayer, but behind every conversation lingered the same question. What would Caesar do next? He returned briefly to the capital, not to claim a throne, not to declare absolute power. He was named dictator, an emergency position allowed under Roman law, but he held it only long enough to manage grain supplies, settle debts, and prepare for the campaign ahead. Then he relinquished the title and left the city again. It was a message. He had not crossed the Rubicon to wear a crown. He had crossed it to correct what he believed had been broken. The ships were made ready. He sailed across the Adriatic in winter, risking weather and uncertainty. Not all his troops could follow at once. He landed in Epirus with a fraction of his force, knowing Pompey waited with larger numbers, fresher supplies, and the backing of many senators. Caesar did not hesitate. He marched inland, established his camp, and began to move like a man with nothing but time. He did not allow worry to shape his orders. He sent messengers back across the sea. He waited for the rest of his legions to arrive. Pompey, aware of Caesar's smaller force, kept his distance. He watched for weakness. He expected recklessness. It never came. When Caesar's remaining troops reached him, the two armies stood nearly equal. They shadowed one another through open plains and wooded hills, each seeking an edge, neither striking blindly. Then came Pharsalus, a wide field under a pale sky. No walls, no traps, only open ground, and two armies facing each other. Pompey held the high ground. His numbers were greater. His cavalry outnumbered Caesar's. He believed the battle could be won without risk. Caesar saw it differently. He placed his men carefully. He thinned his center slightly, reinforcing the flanks. He hid a reserve behind his right, a quiet shield against the expected cavalry charge. The signal was given. The battle began. Pompey's horsemen struck as predicted, but Caesar's reserve moved forward, not with panic, but precision. They held, then pushed. Pompey's flank wavered. The rest followed. Caesar's troops advanced as one body, not with fury, with rhythm. They did not chase. They pressed forward, each line supporting the next. By late afternoon, the field belonged to Caesar. Pompey fled. His army scattered. His allies vanished into distant provinces. And Caesar, standing in the quiet that followed, offered pardon to those who asked for it. He did not parade prisoners. He did not burn cities. He walked among the wounded and spoke to his commanders in low tones. He did not smile. He did not boast. He simply moved forward. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking shelter with King Ptolemy. But the court, fearing Caesar's anger, chose a different path. They received Pompey on the shore and ended his life before he could step fully into safety. They presented his severed head to Caesar as a gift. Caesar, when he saw it, did not praise them. He turned away. He had not wished for Pompey's death. He had wished for his return, not as a rival, but as a Roman. He remained in Egypt for a time. There he met Cleopatra, the young queen locked in her own quiet battle for power. Their alliance began not with politics, but with shared purpose. She saw in Caesar not a conqueror, but a path toward stability. He saw in her not a symbol, but a leader. Together, they restored her throne, but Rome still waited. The Senate, scattered and humbled, awaited his return. Caesar set sail once more. As his ship crossed the waters back toward Italy, the wind moved softly through the sails. He stood near the edge of the deck, watching the coastline come into view, not with triumph in his eyes, but with something deeper, responsibility. He had won the battle for Rome, but the question remained, what would he do with it? Part 9. The Queen of the Nile. The sea turned a deeper shade of blue as the ship neared the Egyptian coast. The waters grew calm. The breeze lost its sharpness. Sunlight fell in broad, golden sheets across the deck. Gulls circled slowly overhead, drifting above sails that fluttered without urgency. Ahead, Alexandria rose from the horizon, not as a fortress, but as a mosaic. The lighthouse of Pharos stood tall over the harbor, its pale stone catching the sky's full light. Temples glowed beneath the sun, their columns carved with gods who had watched the Nile long before Rome was built. Palm trees swayed in the heat, and the smell of sand and salt drifted through the wind. Caesar watched quietly as the harbor came into view. He had not come to conquer Egypt. He had come to follow Pompey, but the moment he stepped onto the quay, the air shifted. The murder of his rival had changed more than one fate. It had drawn him into a world ruled not by swords, but by symbols. The palace stood near the shoreline. Its halls were wide and cool, with painted ceilings and tiled floors that echoed softly with each step. Servants moved without sound. Incense drifted in thin lines through the air. Water pooled in still fountains, reflecting the archways in perfect silence. It was here that Caesar first saw Cleopatra. She did not enter with fanfare. She did not dress in gold or shout for attention. She appeared at night, delivered secretly into the palace, wrapped in cloth and carried in a rug, unrolling quietly into the center of the Romans' temporary quarters. He did not speak right away. Neither did she. They studied one another, not with suspicion, with understanding. Cleopatra was young, but already shaped by conflict. Her brother ruled beside her in name, though not in truth. She had been exiled, then returned. She had faced betrayal within her own family, and now stood before the most powerful general in the Roman world. She spoke with confidence. Her Latin was clear, her Greek graceful. She did not ask for protection. She offered partnership. Caesar listened. He asked few questions. He made no promises, but he did not turn her away. The days that followed passed slowly. Outside the palace, the city stirred. Inside, decisions were made without drama. Caesar sent for Pompey's assassins. They were punished, not with rage, but with order. He did not raise his voice. He issued his commands with the same calm tone he had used in the fields of Gaul. He recognized Cleopatra as queen, not by inheritance alone, but by presence. The court, caught off guard, reacted with confusion. Some aligned with her immediately. Others plotted behind closed doors. Caesar did not interfere in every corner. He watched, waited, and stepped only where necessary. His presence in Alexandria lasted through the change of season. He walked the city without guard at times. He visited the library, sat among scholars, and asked questions of the priests who kept the old records. He learned how the Nile shaped the land, how the stars told time, how grain passed from hand to hand, from field to port, from temple to ship. He did not pretend to belong, but he did not remain apart. He shared meals with Cleopatra in quiet rooms lit by oil lamps. They spoke of politics, poetry, language. She showed him papyrus scrolls older than the Roman calendar. He spoke of Rome not as a destination, but as a system that could bend, break, or endure. In the city, rumors moved like water. Some whispered that Caesar had come to rule Egypt. Others said he had lost his focus. But the truth was simpler. He had found a moment of pause. A place where time did not chase itself. A space where thought moved slower than the sound of a soldier's boots. Still, unrest grew. Cleopatra's brother, led by court advisors, raised arms against her. Troops loyal to the old order took to the streets. For a time, Alexandria burned. Smoke curled over the rooftops. Stones crashed against temple steps. Swords clashed not in open battlefields, but along alleyways and across causeways. Caesar did not retreat. He directed Roman troops through the city. He held the harbor. He kept the palace secure. He did not seek destruction, only control. In the chaos, the great library caught fire. No one could say how it started. By the time the flames faded, scrolls that had lived for centuries were gone. Caesar said little about the loss, but those who saw him after said his face was still, not cold, not angry, simply quiet. Eventually the conflict ended. Cleopatra's brother died. Her rule was recognized. Rome accepted the outcome. No formal treaty was signed. No parade marched through the streets. Just a stillness that returned after weeks of tension. Life resumed. Trade moved again. Boats filled with grain sailed out to sea. And Caesar, as always, prepared to move forward. But before he left, Cleopatra bore a son. The boy was named Caesarion. The child's existence added another layer to the story that followed Caesar wherever he went. Some saw it as scandal, others as legacy. Caesar made no declarations. He simply returned to Rome. The sea carried him westward once again. The wind pulled at the sails. Behind him, the sun rose over the Nile. Ahead, the future waited. In Alexandria, Cleopatra ruled not with fear, but with vision. In Rome, senators whispered more urgently than before. And Caesar, having stood in the marble courts of a foreign world, stepped once again into his own, unchanged in voice, but deeper in presence. Part 10. A Dictator in Peace. When Caesar stepped back onto Roman soil, he found the city familiar in structure, but changed in spirit. The arches, streets, and statues remained, yet something quieter had taken hold. People watched from shaded corners. Merchants lowered their voices. The forum, once filled with debate, now waited in measured stillness. His return was not marked by fanfare. He entered early, passing beneath the stone archways before most had risen. A few looked up from their stalls. A child held his father's hand a little tighter. Others simply watched. Rome, ever conscious of its own story, understood this moment carried weight. Caesar accepted the title of dictator again, this time for a longer term. The Senate passed it with divided minds, some in genuine support, others in quiet surrender. No speech claimed the honor. No triumph followed. He wore the responsibility with quiet focus. The Republic, for all its grandeur, stood in disrepair. Grain shipments faltered. Courts stalled. Deaths strangled common families. Even time itself had lost its rhythm, the calendar so misaligned with the seasons that farmers had begun to guess at planting times. Caesar faced these challenges with deliberate pace. Grain supply was reorganized not to win applause, but to ease hunger. Legal proceedings were restructured so citizens could seek justice without drowning in delay. Public debt was addressed through reforms that balanced relief with sustainability. One of his most lasting efforts came with the calendar. With guidance from Egyptian scholars and Roman mathematicians, he introduced a new system, clearer, steadier, better aligned with the sun. The Julian calendar would carry order across generations, even after statues fell and buildings crumbled. He did not rule from a marble tower. Each day he walked among citizens. Builders saw him reviewing aqueducts. Artisans heard his questions about grain scales and temple repairs. His steps were quiet, but his presence reached into every district. Rather than punish his opponents, he extended clemency. Letters of pardon arrived where swords had once been feared. Even those who doubted his motives could not deny the effect of his choices. Fields began to flourish again. The city exhaled. Housing was rebuilt in neglected neighborhoods. Public projects resumed. Citizenship expanded beyond Italy to include loyal provincials from Spain, Gaul, and the East. Roads were opened not only for troops, but for merchants and travelers whose voices had long gone unheard in the Senate. Among Rome's elite, concern simmered beneath polished greetings. Some whispered that power, once shared among many, now pooled too heavily in one place. Caesar's image appeared on coins, a decision rare for a living Roman. Statues were erected in public spaces. Honors, once modest, grew more elaborate. A golden chair was placed for him at public games. Hymns spoke of his achievements alongside Rome's ancient gods. He didn't ask for these tributes, but neither did he refuse them. What had begun as a campaign to restore order had grown into something larger. In temples, offerings were made in his name. In homes, conversations began to shift from politics to legacy. To some, it felt like stability. To others, like something ending. He continued to meet daily with senators. Laws were still passed. The courts remained open. Yet even as familiar forms held, their center began to change. Caesar's voice now shaped not only decisions but the very direction of the Republic. He began preparations for a campaign to the east. Parthia remained unconquered. The memory of Crassus's defeat still lingered. This new effort promised to extend Rome's reach farther than ever before. Caesar mapped the route himself. He reviewed reports from scouts. He spoke with engineers about bridges, water routes, and supplies. This was not a war of pride. It was a calculation, carefully laid. Meanwhile, Rome lived in his shadow. No one could ignore the reforms. The streets grew safer, the courts more efficient. Trade flowed. Yet behind closed doors, distrust grew among those who remembered a time when no single man carried this much weight. The Senate murmured. Some called him a king in all but name. When a golden diadem was placed on his statue, it was quietly removed. When Mark Antony offered him a crown in public, he turned it down, but the moment hung in the air long after. He claimed no throne, but the boundaries of tradition had already blurred. With each step toward greater control, a choice was offered. No one forced him. He simply did not stop. On paper, the Republic remained. But in practice, eyes looked not to the Senate for guidance, but to Caesar alone. He carried it all with composure. A man reshaping the state, not through fire and conquest, but by slow correction. Brick by brick, law by law. His vision was clear, but around him, the silence thickened. As he prepared to leave for Parthia, unrest gathered behind smiles and robes. Not in the streets, but in the spaces between words. Some still believed he could be reasoned with. Others had made a different decision. And as Rome moved through the final days of winter, the month of March crept forward, quiet and steady. The plan had been drawn, and history was about to hold its breath once more. Part 11. The Senate Whispers. March arrived without flourish. The skies above Rome remained pale, as if winter still lingered, uncertain whether to depart. Thin clouds stretched across the morning sun, and the wind, while not sharp, carried a quiet chill through the narrow streets. Life moved as it always had. Bread was baked, water was drawn. Temples opened their doors at dawn. But beneath the rhythm of the city, something hushed waited. Inside the curia, words were measured more carefully than usual. Senators entered with familiar greetings, exchanged polite glances, and took their places on the long stone benches. From the outside, little seemed changed. Yet behind lowered voices and brief nods, an unease had settled. No one spoke of it aloud, but they knew. Caesar continued his work without delay. He read petitions, signed orders, received envoys from distant provinces. Plans for the Eastern campaign remained in motion. Reports were reviewed, provisions tallied, engineers consulted. It was not a time of pause. But for those who watched closely, there was something different in the air around him. Less urgency, perhaps, and more reflection. He walked often now, not with purpose alone, but with presence. Through the forum, along the marble edges of public squares, past monuments raised in earlier years. He passed no crowds, only quiet observers. Some bowed as he walked, others looked away. The city no longer argued. It listened. His words carried a calm authority that needed no force behind it. He did not need to raise his voice to be heard. He spoke, and the room listened. He entered, and the conversation shifted. And in that shift, something deeper began to stir, not only admiration, but fear. Caesar had reshaped Rome without tearing it apart. But in doing so, he had become something it had never seen before. The title of dictator, once temporary, had stretched beyond what the Republic had known. Statues rose across the city, his image stamped onto silver coins, days renamed in his honor, honors accumulated without request. Some he accepted out of duty, others arrived without his asking. But each one changed how others saw him. In private courtyards and shadowed colonnades, senators gathered to speak in tones that would not carry. They weighed not Caesar's power, but the distance between what he was and what Rome had always believed it must remain. Their words were not angry. They were careful, and in their caution, a decision began to form. They remembered kings from the old stories. Tarquinius Superbus, driven from the throne centuries ago. Julius Caesar, for all his restraint, stood close to a line that many believed must never be crossed. He had refused a crown when offered, but he had not refused the path that led there. He had named magistrates without consultation. He had sat apart from the Senate, not above it, but outside the rhythm that bound all others. His intentions were not in question, but his presence, strong and unchanging, began to feel too permanent. The conspirators gathered slowly, not out of ambition, but from a belief, however flawed, that the Republic could only breathe freely again if Caesar no longer stood at its center. Brutus was among them, Cassius as well. Others joined, not all known for their virtue, but all united by a single thought. They would act not for themselves, but for Rome. At night they planned. During the day, they passed Caesar in the halls, spoke with courtesy, and accepted his greetings. He did not appear suspicious. He did not retreat into guarded chambers. He welcomed discussion. He invited conversation. He believed his reforms, his decisions, his years of service had built a Rome that could move forward together. He did not expect the end to arrive so soon. In the days leading up to the Ides, omens were spoken of. Unusual birds above the capital, unsettling dreams in the home of his wife, warnings from priests. Friends urged caution. Stay home, they said. Postpone the Senate meeting. But Caesar, clear in his thinking, calm in his judgment, dismissed the fears. He had always walked forward, through war, through politics, through resistance, not with recklessness, but with faith in the path he had chosen. On the morning of the 15th of March, he rose early. The sun had not fully climbed. The city was still. He dressed in white, the folds of his toga pressed clean. Outside, the streets stretched in silence. He moved toward the forum slowly, stopping once to speak with a man who held a scroll, another to greet a passing child. When he reached the theater of Pompey, where the Senate would meet, he climbed the steps without pause. Inside, the room was quiet. Senators stood as he entered. He nodded in return. No guards waited at the door. Only shadows and silence. He took his place among them. The first blade struck without warning. There were no words, only movement. The others followed. He did not cry out. He turned once, saw Brutus, and met his eyes without accusation. Then the noise faded, and Rome stood still. The floor beneath the curia was washed clean before sunset. The statues remained. The wind shifted above the rooftops. Then the man who had crossed rivers, calmed provinces, reformed laws, and reshaped a world lay still. Part 12. The Ides of March. The city did not roar in response. It whispered. When the news broke, it moved slowly through the streets, carried by breathless runners, echoed in hushed tones between merchants, passed from ear to ear without full belief. Caesar was dead. Not in battle, not in exile, not by illness or distant misfortune, but on the floor of the Senate, at the foot of a statue, among men he had once called colleagues. The very place where laws were debated and the republic given voice had become the place where its most powerful figure was silenced. Shops closed early that day, some by order, most by instinct. The markets fell quiet. Temple doors remained open, but no prayers were spoken above a whisper. Citizens walked without meeting each other's eyes, and the forum, so often alive with argument and laughter, stood suspended in uneasy stillness. Inside the Curia of Pompey, the air hung heavy. Blood had dried across the marble floor where Caesar had fallen. His body remained where it had landed, slumped beside the base of the statue of Pompey. It was an irony no one dared speak of. The very likeness of his old rival had stood over him as the blades fell, perhaps watching, perhaps judging. The senators who had carried out the act had already fled the building, some slipping out through side entrances, others moving quickly down alleys, their togas stained not only with blood, but with fear of what might follow. No one came to claim the body for many hours. Messengers were sent, but answers came slowly. The people did not rise in joy. There was no celebration in the streets. What had been done was not yet understood. Caesar had become more than a man in recent years. His presence had shaped the rhythm of the city. To many, he was a voice that steadied. To others, a figure who gave Rome direction when it had drifted. Now, that voice was gone, and the silence that followed felt not like freedom, but uncertainty. At home, Calpurnia collapsed when she heard. Her warning had not been enough. She had begged him to stay that morning. She had dreamt of ruins and shadows, of blood flowing from statues and the sound of thunder without storm. But Caesar, ever composed, had gone out just as he always had. He had believed in the world he helped shape. He had believed in order. He had believed he could walk safely among the very walls he had preserved. Mark Antony, his most trusted ally, had not been present during the killing. Whether by design or fortune, he was delayed, perhaps kept away intentionally. When word reached him, he did not shout or weep. He moved quickly, gathering information, gauging the mood, noting which senators were still in the city and which had already slipped into the countryside. He did not speak Caesar's name aloud. He did not yet raise his voice, but his eyes, sharp and focused, missed nothing. Brutus, among the conspirators, found no joy in the outcome. Though he had acted with conviction, imagining he served the greater good, he now stood in the shadow of something he could not fully control. The Republic had not risen up to applaud the deed. The people had not flooded the forum with cheers. Instead, there was silence, long and unbroken. The others who had lifted blades with him, Cassius, Casca, Tribonius, moved restlessly in dark corners, unsure if their actions would be honored or avenged. By evening, Caesar's body was removed under guard, not by soldiers, but by servants and allies who had remained close. He was taken back to his home, wrapped not in golden fabric, but in linen streaked with red. His wounds were counted. The final number rose to more than 20. Some had pierced armor, others had struck cloth. A few had found only skin, while others went deep into muscle and bone. It was not a quick death, yet those who had stood nearby reported that he had not cried out once. As night fell over Rome, the lamps in the forum remained unlit. The stars above looked down on a city that did not know what to do with its grief. Not all had loved him. Many had feared the changes he brought, but even his critics had come to depend on his clarity, his steadiness. He had kept the tides of ambition from breaking the walls. He had balanced tradition and reform in a way few before him had managed. With his absence came the realization that no one remained who held the threads as tightly. The funeral was arranged in haste. Crowds gathered early, not by summons, but by instinct. They filled the square, packed the streets, lined the rooftops. No man's death had ever drawn so many with so few words. Some brought flowers. Others carried sprigs of laurel or small coins, symbols of respect or tribute. Many brought nothing but silence. A wooden platform had been raised in the forum. On it, Caesar's body was laid out, wrapped in white, arms at his sides. Around him were simple garlands, olive branches, and the signs of his office, not crowns, not tokens of kingship, but the emblems of service, scrolls, maps, and his soldier's cloak. Mark Antony stood to speak. He did not raise his voice above what was needed. He did not accuse. He did not call for revenge. Instead, he spoke of the man as he had known him, patient, deliberate, guided not by greed, but by duty. He named the battles. He recalled the reforms. He reminded the people of the days when the city had wavered and Caesar had kept it from falling. When the speech ended, no signal was given. Yet the crowd surged toward the pyre. The platform, made of plain boards, was set alight not by order, but by instinct. Torches were raised. Flames leapt quickly, licking the linen, cracking the garlands, swallowing the wood. As the fire grew, the people wept. Not for an emperor, not for a god, but for something steady that had been lost. Some cried for the Republic. Others cried for Rome. But most cried without knowing why. The night burned longer than expected, and even as the flames began to fall to embers, no one left. They stood together in the smoke, shoulder to shoulder, eyes turned toward the last of the light. It was not a riot. It was not a revolt. It was something quieter. A city in mourning. A nation without shape. In the days that followed, the conspirators fled. Their names, once spoken in the Senate with honor, now traveled in fearful whispers. Some vanished into the hills. Others sailed for distant islands. Brutus lingered longest, unsure of whether what had been done could still be explained. But time had already begun to shape the story without him. Caesar's reforms were not undone. His calendar remained. His roads continued to be built. The laws he had passed still held. And his absence became a presence, shaping what would come next with even greater force than he had shaped what had come before. Rome did not collapse. It did not rise either. It waited, and the waiting would become the beginning of something new. Part 13, Ashes and Oratory. Smoke still clung to the corners of the forum days after the funeral. Though the wind had moved most of it on, there remained in the stone a faint scent of burnt wood and oil. The boards that had once held Caesar's body had turned to soft black ash, scattered by feet and wind and the weight of mourning. Rome carried on. Markets reopened, carts rolled through the streets, and senators returned to the Curia. But underneath the surface, something had broken loose and would not settle again. The city was not grieving in silence anymore. Conversations, once careful, had become charged. Bakers spoke of betrayal while kneading dough. Merchants measured more than goods, weighing names and faces against loyalty. The people had not forgotten the calm that had followed Caesar's reforms, the bread that had arrived on time, the stability that had reached even the poorest districts, the presence of a man who had walked among them without fear. Now, in the space he had left behind, there was only uncertainty. Mark Antony understood this mood better than most. He had stood close to Caesar in both politics and battle, but more importantly, he knew the rhythm of the crowd. In the days after the funeral, he did not rush to act. He walked through the forum, exchanged nods with artisans, lingered near fountains where elders sat. His silence was not one of grief, it was preparation. He listened, and he learned how far the sorrow had spread. When the Senate met, Antony did not raise alarm. He spoke of order. He reminded the gathered men that Caesar had left behind documents, wills, decrees, plans. These were not dreams written in isolation, but decisions meant to guide Rome forward. He insisted they be honored. Some senators nodded, agreeing in principle, though uneasy in heart. Others, those who had once sat beside Caesar in public and cursed him in private, worried. The fire had not consumed only wood. It had stirred emotion in a city that no longer trusted them. The will was opened in the presence of the people. What it revealed was not power hoarded, but generosity extended. A sum of money was left to every citizen, enough to be felt, enough to be remembered. Caesar had also bequeathed his private gardens to the public, opening green spaces near the Tiber where families could walk and rest. These were not gestures of grandeur, they were proof of care. And when these words were read aloud, the crowd responded not with shouts, but with a murmur that traveled quickly through every alley and square. That murmur soon became something louder. Antony stepped forward with timing sharpened by patience. He rose to speak again, not within the marble walls of the Senate, but before the citizens who filled the forum, standing where Caesar had once walked. His voice carried without force. He did not scream. He did not condemn. He told stories. He recalled Caesar's discipline in war, his attention to the smallest of reforms, the steadiness of a man who had asked little for himself but had given much to Rome. He spoke of the wounds, each one described plainly, each cut made not by strangers but by men Caesar had trusted. He named no one with hatred. But each word laid bare a truth. This had not been the end of a tyrant, it had been the killing of a leader. The forum grew restless. Faces turned toward one another. Fists clenched. What had begun as mourning sharpened into something else. And Antony, who had given the people their silence when they needed it, now gave them their voice. He held aloft Caesar's blood-stained robe, a simple garment pierced again and again. He did not speak of revenge. He spoke of justice. That distinction, though subtle, changed everything. From that moment, Rome was no longer still. Crowds moved through the streets, not with torches, but with purpose. The homes of the conspirators, those who had fled or still lingered behind guarded doors, became symbols of betrayal. Windows were shuttered. Doors were barred. Walls once polished by generations were now marked with ash and anger. Some senators vanished entirely, seeking refuge far beyond the city's reach. Others issued statements pleading for calm, but their words drifted like leaves in wind. Antony's position grew stronger, not by decree, but by attention. Every whisper now passed through his name. He appeared at the forum, in temples, at funerals of veterans who had served with Caesar. He called for the laws Caesar had written to be enforced without delay. He framed his cause not as vengeance, but as completion. Still, not all accepted his rise without challenge. In the distance, a new figure prepared to enter the city. Gaius Octavius, known to most as Octavian, had been named in Caesar's will as adopted son and heir. Barely grown into manhood, he had been studying quietly in the provinces when news of the assassination reached him. Many expected him to remain where he was, safe and removed. Few imagined that the teenager would ride toward the capital, not with soldiers at his back, but with resolve built on legacy. When he arrived, Rome watched him with suspicion and curiosity. He spoke softly. He made no demands. But like Caesar, he observed first, speaking only when necessary. He acknowledged Antony's position, yet reminded others of the words Caesar had written with his own hand. The will, the name, the intention, they had weight. And in Octavian's presence, even those who had hoped to reshape Rome in their image began to hesitate. The city stood at a threshold. The fire had passed, but the embers still glowed. Oratory had become a weapon. Words chosen carefully struck deeper than swords, And in this quiet war of speeches, loyalties shifted. Some who had once applauded the conspirators now questioned their choices. Others clung to the idea of the Republic as it had been, not because they believed it would return, but because they did not yet know what would take its place. Caesar's ashes had cooled, but his presence remained. It remained in the laws still being followed, the calendars still being used, the roads still being built. It lingered in the forum, in the stories told by elders, and in the quiet pride of soldiers who had marched with him. His legacy did not fade, it unfolded. And as Rome looked toward the horizon, no longer certain what lay ahead, it carried forward the memory of a man who had once walked without armor, without crown, and changed everything simply by refusing to step aside. Part 14. The Empire Awakens. The Roman Republic had not fallen in a single moment. It had not shattered with the swing of a sword or crumbled under the weight of one man's rule. Instead, it unraveled like a worn thread, pulled gently, steadily, until the garment no longer held its shape. After Caesar's death, Rome did not descend into chaos, not immediately. The institutions still stood, senators still met, the courts still functioned. But something had changed that could not be put back. Where once the Senate had spoken with conviction, it now hesitated. Its authority no longer felt unshakable. Decisions took longer. Voices grew softer. And while no dictator claimed the city by force, power shifted all the same. The people, too, had changed. They had seen what calm leadership could bring, and in its absence, they no longer placed their full trust in ceremony or tradition. They looked instead for presence, for someone to guide, to decide, to steady the trembling balance between fear and hope. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, watched this shift from within. He was not yet the man history would come to know, but even in youth, he carried the stillness of someone who understood the weight of silence. He did not rush forward with grand speeches or sweeping promises. Instead, he moved carefully through Rome's political cracks, listening more than speaking, learning which doors would open to quiet persistence. Though young, he carried a name that mattered. And in Rome, names held power long before swords ever did. Mark Antony, meanwhile, held the loyalty of the veterans. He had fought beside Caesar, stood with him in the field, defended his decisions in the Senate. He believed the Republic could still stand, not as it had, but in a form strong enough to survive new pressures. His authority came not from inheritance, but from memory. Soldiers remembered him. People recognized him. His voice, deep and practiced, filled the forum in a way that stirred familiar feelings of order. At first, the two men moved as uneasy allies. Both claimed to act in Caesar's name. Both spoke of preserving Rome, and for a time, it seemed the tension might settle into balance. Yet below the surface, their paths pulled in different directions. Antony sought stability through command. Octavian, less obvious in his ambition, sought it through legitimacy. The Senate, ever eager to reclaim its influence, tried to use the rift to its advantage. It gave formal recognition to Octavian's claim as Caesar's heir. At the same time, it resisted Antony's growing reach. Instead of restoring equilibrium, the effort deepened the divide. Each faction gathered its own alliances. Governors chose sides. Legions moved across provinces. Roads that once welcomed trade now watched for marching feet. What followed was not immediate war, but a quiet rehearsal of one. Rome had endured civil strife before. Sulla, Marius, Caesar, and Pompey. Each time, the ground beneath the Republic shifted a little more. Now, with every move between Octavian and Antony, the center stretched thinner. Yet even as alliances formed and promises were whispered in torchlit halls, no one spoke directly of monarchy. The word remained too heavy, too dangerous to invoke aloud. But the shape of power had begun to take on new contours, no longer shared equally, no longer bound by the checks that had once defined Roman identity. Lepidus entered the stage during this time. A seasoned general and former consul, he had no claim to Caesar's name, but brought with him influence and command over troops. Octavian and Antony saw in him an opportunity, a third figure to balance the scale, a name to lend their efforts a sense of structure. Together, the three formed an uneasy partnership that became known as the Second Triumvirate. It was a legal arrangement sanctioned by the Senate, but beneath the surface, it marked something unprecedented. No longer were decisions filtered through the usual channels. The triumvirs held power to pass laws, appoint officials, even condemn enemies without trial. The rule of law, once debated openly, now passed through the hands of three. Rome adjusted, slowly and reluctantly. Some saw the new leadership as a temporary necessity. Others feared it was the beginning of something permanent. But as the triumvirs solidified their roles, it became clear that the old ways would not return. The most brutal expression of this new authority came in the proscriptions. Lists were posted in public squares, each bearing the names of those declared enemies of the state. Some were senators, others were former allies. Wealth, influence, and past service offered no protection. The list grew longer with each passing week, and the fear spread faster than the ink that recorded each name. Those marked for death fled, hid, or bargained. Many did not escape. Cicero was among them. Once Rome's most gifted orator, he had spoken with fire against tyranny, even after Caesar's death. His words had once carried law. Now they carried a death sentence. When he was found, he did not resist. His hands trembled, but his voice did not break. His execution marked the final breath of the Republic's conscience, and Rome, though alive, felt a little quieter afterward. Even within the triumvirate, tension simmered. Trust was thin. Each member watched the others, measured their ambitions, and prepared for a future in which the balance would no longer hold. The alliance served its purpose, for now. But beneath its surface, Rome had already begun shifting again, this time towards something it could not name. Octavian continued to gather strength. His methods were not theatrical, but deliberate. He spoke in plain tones, appealed to reason, and cultivated support through small, repeated gestures. His soldiers respected his discipline. The people respected his restraint. He did not fight for glory. He fought for structure. That distinction, over time, began to matter. Antony, meanwhile, turned east. In Egypt, he found more than strategy. Cleopatra, now a queen in full command of her court, welcomed him not as a guest, but as an equal. Their bond was not only personal, but political. Together, they represented a power beyond Rome's borders, a blend of empires, a union that challenged the singular Roman identity that Octavian quietly guarded. From afar, the people watched. Some still hoped for a return to the old republic. Others saw in Octavian a path to peace. No one yet called him emperor. He had claimed no title beyond what the law allowed. But in every act, he moved closer to something that no longer resembled the world Caesar had left behind. And Rome, weary from years of tension, no longer resisted. It waited. Part 15. The City That Chose a King. The Republic did not end in a single act. No wall was torn down. No final speech echoed over the forum. The institutions remained in place. The calendars still turned, the temple still opened each morning, and the Senate still met beneath marble ceilings. But beneath these familiar surfaces, the soul of Rome had shifted. Not swiftly, not violently, but gradually, like a tide rising higher with each passing moon. When Octavian prepared for the last campaign, he did so without triumph or threat. He spoke plainly in the Senate, requesting support to face what he described as a crisis of Roman integrity. He did not accuse Antony of treason, though his meaning was clear. He framed the war as a choice between Roman tradition and foreign indulgence, between a future rooted in the Forum and one lured away by the riches of the East. The words were chosen with care. They struck softly, but they settled deeply in the minds of those who had lived through too many years of civil conflict. By now, Antony had tied himself wholly to Cleopatra. Together they ruled from Alexandria, not as co-conspirators, but as sovereigns. Their court glittered with wealth, and their authority rested not on Roman law, but on divine lineage and absolute rule. Cleopatra was not a passive queen. She commanded with precision and intellect. She had survived palace intrigues and Roman suspicion. With Antony, she offered a new vision of power, one that mixed Egyptian majesty with Roman discipline. To some, it appeared inevitable. To others, it appeared dangerous. Rome watched from afar. The distance between the Tiber and the Nile was great, but the tension bridged it without difficulty. Stories reached the capital, of coronations in Alexandria, of Antony declaring Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, the rightful heir to Caesar's legacy. Octavian, still in Rome, countered not with armies at first, but with parchment. He read Antony's supposed will aloud in the Senate, a document that confirmed the worst fears of the conservatives. Lands bequeathed to Egyptian royalty. Titles handed down without consent of the Roman people. Whether forged, exaggerated, or genuine, the words were enough. The city responded not with a roar, but with a shift in posture. Allies who had wavered moved closer to Octavian. Governors pledged loyalty. Veterans, promised land and security, gathered beneath banners bearing the new Caesar's name. The Senate, its spine long bent, offered formal support for a campaign. It was not an act of patriotism. It was self-preservation. The preparations for war were swift and practiced. Rome had grown used to conflict. Legions formed along the Adriatic. Ships were fitted in harbors along the western coast. Messengers rode out daily, carrying orders that stretched across 3 continents. Octavian's command was not based in spectacle. He delegated with precision, choosing commanders known for loyalty and calm under pressure. His goal was not to inspire fear. It was to appear inevitable. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces in the east. Their fleets assembled at Actium, a narrow bay in western Greece. The location was strategic, a place where sea and land met tightly, where a smaller force could hold off a larger one if the winds were right. Their ships outnumbered those of Octavian. Their treasury was deeper, their soldiers more experienced, and yet something in their alliance had begun to fray. Supplies ran thin. Support from the provinces waned. Some of Antony's commanders doubted Cleopatra's presence, whispered that her counsel pulled him from clarity. Still, they waited. Still, they believed. Octavian arrived with Agrippa, his most trusted general. Agrippa, brilliant and practical, had prepared the strategy well in advance. He did not seek to overwhelm the enemy by strength alone, but to corner them, cut supply lines, trap them in a bay they believed they controlled. Over weeks, Octavian's fleet moved into place like a net tightening. When the battle began, it unfolded not as a clash of gods, but as a slow unraveling. Cleopatra's fleet broke away first, sailing south under full sail. Antony, stunned but drawn to her, followed. The remaining forces hesitated, then collapsed. Those who had once pledged their swords to Caesar's heir now raised them for Octavian. By nightfall, the sea lay quiet again, and the course of history had tilted. Word of the victory spread quickly. It crossed the mountains of Greece, echoed through the markets of Sicily, reached Rome before the returning ships. There was no rejoicing in the streets. The city had seen too much to celebrate war, but it breathed differently. For the first time in years, the outcome felt certain. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Egypt. They fortified Alexandria, preparing for what they knew must come. Letters were sent, last offers made, but Rome did not answer. Octavian moved steadily along the coast, his pace measured, his advance consistent. No threat, no bluster, just the promise that the age of indecision was ending. They died by their own hands in the old tradition of rulers who understood that defeat, once total, offered no dignity in survival. Cleopatra's final moments were not theatrical. She dressed in her royal robes, arranged her chambers with care, and left the world as she had lived, calm, composed, and without apology. Antony followed soon after, his life ending not with the clash of sword, but in the shadow of what had once seemed assured. Octavian entered Alexandria without resistance. He did not burn the palaces. He did not desecrate the tombs. He walked quietly through the city, offering pardon to those who asked, speaking respectfully to those who served. The wealth of Egypt passed into Roman hands, not by force but by order. The grain ships sailed west, the treasury sealed for transport. The boy Caesarion, once declared king of kings, was quietly removed. The threat to Octavian's legacy had to be erased, and Rome had grown practiced at forgetting those it could not include. When Octavian returned to Rome, the people lined the streets. They did not cheer as they once had for generals returning from foreign lands. They stood quietly, watching the man who now held more power than any citizen before him. He did not ride in a chariot. He did not wear a golden wreath. He arrived not as a conqueror, but as the last figure standing. The city had not crowned him. It had accepted him. The Senate offered new titles. Not king, never that. The word remained poisoned by memory. But they gave him honors no one had received before. They called him Augustus, a name drawn from religion and reverence, not command. It suggested more than leadership. It suggested destiny. He accepted with humility, or what resembled it. He insisted the republic remained. He returned power to the Senate, in name, and accepted it back in practice. He claimed no monarchy, but the reins of governance passed through his hands. The army answered to him. The provinces reported to his appointees. The coin bore his image. The calendar marked his victories. He was not a dictator. He was something new. Over the next years, Augustus restored what Caesar had once tried to build. Roads were repaved. Temples rebuilt. The grain supply secured. The tax system reformed. Peace returned to the countryside. Pirates no longer sailed the coasts. Bandits no longer haunted the Appian Way. The empire expanded in quiet waves, not by desperate conquest, but by steady claim. The city changed with him. Marble replaced mud brick. Statues rose in his image, not by demand, but by admiration. Poets wrote of a golden age, scholars recorded his lineage, and generals saluted not the republic, but the man who guided it. In the forum, debates still took place, but they echoed differently, as though everyone speaking already knew where the real decision would be made. And so the empire was born, not in fire but in comfort. The people, weary from generations of war, accepted the new structure because it asked less of them. It provided safety. Bread arrived when it was needed. Justice, while slower, was more predictable. The dreams of shared rule faded into stories told by elders. Augustus ruled not as a tyrant, but as a gardener. He pruned where needed. He planted where decay had taken root. He left the outward shape of the republic intact, while quietly redirecting its flow. Few resisted. Fewer still understood how much had changed. Even Caesar, had he lived, might have struggled to recognize what his legacy had become. The man who had feared a crown now gave his name to an era. The calendar marked his death, and festivals remembered his birth. His assassination, once seen as a defense of liberty, had become the hinge between old Rome and new. The final irony settled like dust over the Curia where he had fallen. Statues rose not only for Augustus, but for Caesar as well. The man who had been killed for gathering too much power was now worshipped in temples as a god. His face, once feared by conspirators, now looked down from coins and monuments with serenity. In time, children would grow up never hearing the word republic except in distant history. They would speak of emperors and provinces, of armies and roads, of Rome as the center of a world that no longer needed to share power. They would learn that Julius Caesar had been great, that Augustus had been wise, and that Rome had always been destined for this shape. No throne had been built. No crown had been placed, and yet the city had chosen a king, not through revolution, not through law, but through weariness, through longing for order, and through the slow understanding that power, once gathered, does not return easily to the many hands that once held it. And so the republic ended not with fire, but with silence. And the empire rose in its place,